Hello. I'm going to start with what I hope is a fairly provocative question. I'm going to start by asking, with the rise of behavioral science, should we actually care anymore what people think or feel? Or should we just concentrate on what they do? Because when it comes down to it, consumers are people, and consumption is a behavior. It's a series of behaviors. And in fact, if I take it further than that, if the way I'm going to be judged today is on what you say to each other, which is a behavior, how you email each other, which is a behavior, what you actually communicate and you feed back, then should I really care what you think? If you think I was terrible, but you tell everybody I was great, is my job done? I think we all know the answer to that. We all know that there are several different answers to that, one of which is, I think that would make us terribly socially unacceptable if we did that. But also, what's really important is how that behavior is driven. And we like to think about behavior as being driven by the person and the context together. This is a concept come up which was created originally by probably the father of change theory, a man called Kurt Lewin, a social psychologist. Now, his original equation is the one at the top, which says behavior is driven by a dynamic field. Now, there's a lot of complex terminology, but basically what the dynamic field means is by the person and by the context. And if you think, what we do in terms of the marketing mix is we look to shape one or other part of that. So, for example, advertising is about changing attitudes quite a lot of the time. It's about changing the person. Whereas actual prices on shelves, distribution, whether it's there or not when you want it, that's about changing the context in which somebody sits. Okay? And I think it's really important to think of these things, because as soon as we start to think of these things, we can see where attitudes play, but also how we can actually start to bring things together. And from a point of view of Ipsos, what we've done is we've taken those two elements, the person and the context, and we split them down into two elements each. And this is what our behavioral maps framework is. So I'm going to go through each of these points in detail in a few minutes. But briefly, when we look at it from a personal point of view, we look at personal motivation and ability or capability. From a situational point of view, we look at the physical situation in which you find yourself and the social situation. So that might well explain behavior, but how do you go about changing it? Well, this is where we have what we describe as the 4I process. And this process will probably look fairly familiar to a lot of you because it's quite similar to a marketing process. Probably the area which is the bit that people tend to spend the least time on concentrating on at the moment is this first section, the identify. Can we define any problem or any opportunity in terms of actual behaviors? And how specific can we be about those actual behaviors? Now, we tend to do a lot of this stuff instinctively anyway, so we talk about first moment of truth, which is about behaviors in front of a shelf. But can we be more specific? Because that has a big impact on what we buy and what we don't. Now, earlier on, you were all hearing that actually understanding or actually knowing what people do is becoming easier and easier. And actually it is. If we look at a lot of digital sources, they will tell you what you're doing. You're giving away huge amounts of data about what you're actually doing on your mobile phone, on your computer every day. But what it doesn't tell you, which is the really interesting bit, is why you're doing it or why you're not doing what we want you to do. This is really the second section around insight, and this is really what we spend a lot of time in our field understanding, and understanding how it can then help you. The third part of it, the intervention, It's really simple, because interventions are just the levers you can pull. Now, all levers have different qualities to them. So advertising, for example, is great at creating social norms, but isn't as good as a revolving door at stopping people coming into a building one at a time. So they all have different levers. And the last part is the improved part, which is just, even with the best will in the world, sometimes what we do can have accidental, unforeseen consequences. I tend to quote because there aren't many businesses I know who like to share their failures, but luckily enough, the British government does. And one of the campaigns they ran, which was to discourage teenage girls from drinking, had the opposite impact. What it did was it actually normalized the behavior. So every time they ran the ad campaign, what they saw was more people getting drunk rather than less. Luckily enough, because they were evaluating it in the right kind of way, they pulled it. And they pulled it pretty quickly. Now, that was a well-designed campaign, which should have worked really well. But it just didn't. It had an unforeseen consequence. And this in itself is quite important. Anyway, enough of the actual process of how you put it into place. Let's go back and look a bit more about behavior itself and the drivers. I think motivation is often the one that we talk about and think about the most. And I'll come on and talk a bit more about reflective and automatic behavior, because I think a lot of you in this room will have probably heard of it already. But it's worth thinking a bit more about what that actually means for us, and the idea of, in fact, let's have a show of hands. Who's heard of Systems 1, Systems 2 behaviors? Yeah? Quite a few of you, okay? And this is kind of where it sits in this motivation box. So you've got your deep-seated motivations, and then you also have another series on top. So we know about attitudes and your intentions, but also things like your habits. Because habits can actually override your attitudes or intentions quite easily. But first, let's think about two systems of behavior. So, for those of you who've read anything like the Daniel Kahneman book, Thinking Fast and Slow, the thinking fast part is the systems one, is the automatic behavior. It's intuitive, it's instinctive. What you see is all there is. And the second part is the reflective part, the thing that we often think about as thinking. So, we don't like doing it, is the biggest thing to think about here. It's effortful, although it's considered, it's secondary, and it's relatively slow. Now, just to kind of give you an example of that, I mean, we all know what she's thinking, right? And yet what we've done is actually thin slice an awful lot there. We've processed it very quickly. We've done something that's actually amazingly complicated. Behavioral science takes, it's magpie. It takes from all sorts of different areas. And one of the areas it takes from is artificial intelligence. And a very famous professor has said it's relatively easy now to design a computer that can beat anyone in the world at chess, but really difficult to design a computer that can make a cup of coffee in somebody else's kitchen. And yet we'd all find the second one really easy. Now, if we think about systems 2 behavior, here's a quick sum. I can guarantee there'll probably be about 3 people here who really like maths and have actually got the answer to this already. But the rest of you, and this is just to show you what systems 2 behavior is like, and I told you it's effortful, and I told you we're lazy, and we don't like doing it. I don't mean that in a bad way, this is a good way. The rest of you are waiting for me to tell you the answer. Yeah? And I will tell you the answer. The answer is 408. And I'll tell you the answer for one reason alone, which is I've shown this slide once to some people, and I didn't tell them what the answer was. And then at the end of the presentation, when I said, has anybody got any questions, the biggest question was, what's the answer to the sum? So we've talked then about automatic and reflective behavior and where it sits. And let's think about systems 1 for a little minute. Strong brands like Coca-Cola, and Coca-Cola is a brand that I think we've heard about quite a lot today. these strong brands can become what we think of as heuristics. We can actually have a mental shortcut and we can process them using the automatic part of our brain. So, not only can you probably tell me from just seeing part of the symbol that that was Coke, but you could also probably tell me whether it was Coke Zero or regular. That's how automatic we are when we think about it. But the thing about it being an automatic thing is the fact that that limits what we can then do with it. So we can imagine Coke producing any form of soft drink, but we can't imagine it producing house insurance. Now, there are some brands that deliberately set out to change that kind of thing. Brands like Virgin, which start off as a record label and then have their own form of Coke, their own form of airline, and they deliberately push things and make you think, and that's part of how we now use and think about it. But without this brand frame, everything just becomes fairly generic. And so brands really enjoy this, and this is seen more and more, that when you actually get a brand that's strong enough to actually be processed using Systems 1, it becomes very, very strong. I just wanted to put this up because attitudes are really important, because people's attitudes towards drinks do dictate which ones they buy. Having said that, there are other reasons why you might find yourself buying one, and we're going to talk about some of those in a minute. Let's start off then thinking about habits. So what are habits? Well, they're behavioural patterns based on a learnt context and repeated context. So when we see a door handle, we pull it. Very much automatically. It's a habitual behaviour. Even if it says push on the door, we'll still pull it. Because it's associated with us always pulling door handles and them being very successfully opening at that point in time. But habits are difficult things to create, and they take quite a long time to create. So a lot of research recently shows that the minimum time it takes to create a habit is probably about 66 days. And to change a habit, it can take up to about 3 years, depending on what that habit is. And so, for example, in areas like pharma, where you're trying to get people to treat long-term conditions, particularly if that condition clears up with repeated application of a cream, people tend to stop taking and using the cream when it's cleared up. And that's often too short to create a habit. So they are quite important, but they're not actually the be-all and end-all. So now let's think about ability or capability. So capability really is the knowledge or skills that we actually need, or we feel we need. Sometimes we lack something called self-efficacy, which is where we don't feel we can do something. Even though we actually have the skills, we're not necessarily sure that we can do it. But this covers off a multitude of different factors that tend to influence our behaviour. And let's talk about particularly decisions and how we can actually make decisions. Obviously, memory and attention are key parts of it. And for those of you who are big fans of behavioural economics, we're now going to just talk a little bit about biases and heuristics. And for the rest of you, what I'm going to do is use an analogy. This is just a visual analogy to talk about biases. So about half our brains have been developed for eyesight. We have the most sophisticated eyesight of almost any animal. So when we look at this picture, we see two different coloured blocks, right? The blocks with the red arrows pointing to them. And yet if I cover up the shading in the middle, you'll see that actually both those blocks are the same colour. And yet when I remove that again, they go back to being two different colours. This is a bias within our eyesight. This is the way our eyesight interprets things. There's nothing we can actually do to counter it. And given the fact that half our brain was developed for eyesight, you'll be unsurprised to hear, when it comes to other forms of decision making, it's even worse. So if we go back to basics and back to first principles, biases I've talked about, heuristics. Heuristics are essentially mental rules of thumb that we use. So a decision-making strategy or shortcut that allows us to process information faster and make decisions better. And quite a lot of time they are better decisions. And we need to realize that, because they are actually pretty good. You'll see some people say, oh gosh, well, you know, it's just people are really stupid and don't always make the best decision. Well, that's completely wrong. 90% plus of the time we actually make really good decisions. So let's think about one element, anchoring and adjustment. So anchoring, we often use an initial piece of information, which is an anchor, to make subsequent judgments. And I know a lot of people have talked about Apple today. And here is another example of a very clever use of anchoring for Apple. So this is about the launch of the iPad. What should we price it at? If you listen to the pundits, we're going to price it under $1,000. There you go. You've been given an anchor, $1,000. I'm thrilled to announce that the pricing starts not at $999, but just $499. Suddenly it seems cheap, right? I was thinking it's going to be $1,000. It's $499. That's really cheap, because of the initial anchor. On the other hand, if we reframed it and we said, your original iPad cost $199, the new iPad will cost you $499, suddenly it seems really expensive. Okay, physical context. This is actually also one of the things that we do know quite a lot about, but we don't often put together with our attitudes. So when we're understanding what the attitudes and what are our actual ability, we need to think about those in the context of what's actually around us. What are the prices on the supermarket shelves? What is the distribution? Where is it actually going from that point of view? Because everything from distance through to the actual product influence our behavior. Now, it's really interesting. I mean, I have a preferred supermarket brand. I have one that I really like, but it is a mile further away from my house than one that I think is okay. Now, the number of times I go to the one that's okay is over 5 times the number of times I go to the one that I really like. And that's just the impact of distance. There's a whole suite of experiments about this, looking into everything from product choice in supermarkets, through to recycling, through to use of public transport, through to all sorts of things. And what they tend to show is if it's easy and it's available to you and it's actually there, if the physical availability is there, then you tend to do it. So recycling rates go up by, in tests, go up by hundreds of % if you give somebody a box to put the recycling in, compared to, say, if they've got to go a mile to recycle products. It makes a huge difference. And we all know if something isn't on a shelf that we normally buy, we'll buy an alternative. Triggers and prompts. I think triggers and prompts are really interesting. We do tend to, within the marketing community, think about these quite a lot. Because not only is our advertising a trigger and a prompt, but the advertising of our competitors is often one as well. What's actually happening in terms of point of sale, from a similar point of view? That is, again, a trigger or a prompt. The way we design things, how many steps we actually put into them, all act as triggers and prompts to do things. But let's think about something slightly different. This is an example from an FMCG company about size and space. And this is something that I found quite surprising when I saw it, and I probably shouldn't do because I work in the field of behavioral science. But essentially, what they found was that when they were looking at new product development and the launch of new product development, the size and space in people's kitchens in their cupboards dictated whether people bought the product or not. So you went from a situation where we were thinking, oh gosh, what we need to do is change people's attitudes, and to a certain extent, that's probably true. We need to make people want to buy it. But then the thing that stopped them buying it was how much space they had in a cupboard. Sounds crazy, doesn't it? It sounds, you know, I mean, if I really wanted that enough, I should just go out and buy it, right? And yet, this was the significant limiting factor for these people. So, the second half of contextual drivers of behavior. Social behavior, social context. Social context refers to an awful lot of different things. It refers to almost everything that we regard as our background. So, the culture that we've been brought up in, where we were educated, what we live in now, the people we know, our friends, our family, institutions which we interact with, so our place of work, what we do for a job. Let me give you an example of quite how important this can be and how important our background is. I once conducted an experiment with a group of people in a much smaller room than this, who were drawn from advertising industry, PR industry, market research, and also from the world of media buying. And we said to them, okay, how would you solve this problem? And each of the tables had 25 minutes in which to solve the problem. Now, the table that came from the ad industry came back and went, okay, the answer to this is a really good TV ad. The people from the media background went, okay, so you need to spend, to solve this problem, you need to spend about £8 million. And you need to do certain bits in point of sale, you need to have a TV campaign running, and then you need a lot of outdoor running in different places. Good, good. PR guys? The answer was all about PR. And the market researcher's answer was, well, I don't think we know enough about this yet. We need to go off and research it more. And actually what was happening there was that people were just playing to their strengths. They were using their background, and unsurprisingly, they came out with the answers that we'd expect them to. They couldn't necessarily think outside of that, because you can't think outside of your social context. So, social proof. Social proof is really interesting. It's a kind of social norm, really. But people tend to conform to behaviours of others if they assume it's the correct behaviour. So, for example, when we see celebrities doing something, when we see someone who's an expert, when we see social media trending and telling us that this is definitely the right thing to do, when we see our friends or our peers doing it, we tend to conform to that actual behaviour. And a classic example of this, because this is used across the world of e-commerce, and this is probably one of the biggest recommendations I always see when I go and work with guys on the e-commerce side of things, is social proof is definitely one of the things that's there to actually really help us. And we see it in a number of different places. Obviously, I mean, this one's taken from Amazon. What do people actually think about it? What do people actually do with it? TripAdvisor works in exactly the same kind of way. They're really quite important ways of actually shaping our behaviour. And they all actually take into account different things outside of just our attitudes. Okay. So, if we go back to the behavioural maps framework, what I should say is, next time you're, although many people here I presume are too old for this now, But next time you see your kids or your friends going on a date and ordering a drink that they don't like so much, so they have a Pepsi because their date has a Pepsi rather than having a Coke, this doesn't make them stupid, this just makes them normal. If the next time you see somebody who lets their insurance roll over, so they don't want to actually have a look through it, they don't feel competent to look at all the terms and conditions, all the different bits, look at the confusing different plans, or indeed their mobile phone contract, and they do the same, they just let it roll. This doesn't make them odd, even if they're with a brand that they don't like, even if this goes against their attitudes. This again just makes them normal. Next time you're in a different country and you're sitting there and you're thinking, okay, I really want a drink, and the only brand you recognize is Pepsi, and you buy it, that doesn't again make you stupid, that just makes you normal. And these are the key elements to it. And the next time you go into a bar and have just the same thing as your friends have, again, that is perfectly normal. These are all things that drive our behavior in the short term, because an awful lot of our behavior is driven in the short term. Then these are the things that are influencing it. And this is why we look at all these factors and not just attitudes. And that's pretty much all I've got to say. So thank you very much indeed.